ஓகே போட்டுறேன் என்ன? ம். Hello, and welcome everyone to this second installment of Light of the World Tuesday. Of course, last week we had the inaugural episode. It was a good time, and we still have, the technology of the studio and so on are pretty new. And so we hope and pray through God's grace that everything would go on fine. But a brief introduction. Of course, we are a Christian journalism place. We want to give a commentary, a Christian commentary on what's happening in this world, whether it's in terms of politics, morality, society, and so on. We want to shed some light that gives clarity on what the Bible says about our particular behavior and where we can change. We want to keep Jesus at the center of our nation. So I'm glad to be here again in this second installment of the show. Now, before I talk about anything else, of course, many of you might be watching the episode today in the YouTube channel, Operation Stephen. But we also have a dedicated journalism channel. If you haven't subscribed to that so far, may I please encourage you to check out the description of this particular video. Hopefully, there should be a link to the journalism channel, and it'll be lovely if you're able to subscribe to the journalism channel and show your support. We want to essentially be a Christian voice in all the what are meant to be Christian nations. Of course, our studio is based in London in the UK, so our home nation is the UK, but hopefully we'd be covering various aspects of what are happening not just in the UK, but also elsewhere in what is meant to be a Christian nation anywhere in the world. So thank you very much for being here. Now, for those who are curious, of course, on other occasions, we do Christian gospel sharing. Now, there are Christians who are a little bit wary of Christians, giving political commentary. I completely appreciate that. In Light of the World, in our journalism endeavor, what we aim to do is keep our gospel sharing to our other streams, to our other projects. But here we aim to essentially speak to the nation or speak into the nation for us to be able to walk a walk which is worthy of the name by which we are called, which is our precious Lord Jesus Christ. We have to be sensible, we have to be morally upright, and we have to be able to speak to other nations who are not yet Christian, to be able to say, look, these are the biblical ways of doing things. And so I think it's a legitimate cause for Christians to be in journalism. And so I really encourage everyone to continue watching us and continue supporting us and share your feedback. We haven't yet properly set up all our contact channels. Our social media or the email links and so on are not thoroughly set up yet. I do sincerely apologize for that. But hopefully sooner rather than later, we'll have everything working. But you should have the details when things work. You should have the details of how to get in touch with us on the screen at the bottom, I think left or right on your screen at the moment. So with that, let's jump straight to what we have in store for today. I'd like to give you an overview of what's happening this evening. Today, it's going to be two segments. In the first segment, I'm going to speak to a lovely Jewish thought leader on what really happened on the 7th of October, 2023. Of course, prior to the 7th of October, some dates have been very popular amongst us, 9/11 and so on. But now, unfortunately, with what happened in 2023, 7th of October, the date is synonymous with a tragic event in Israel's history. And I want to discuss with this Jewish thought leader to find out how we can keep what happened and what is still, continuing to happen in Israel. The thing hasn't had a closure yet. What is still continuing to happen, I want to really, ask for some thoughts from this Jewish thought leader in Truth of the Matter. Subsequent to which we'll be discussing all right. So, of course, this is there has been a technical glitch there. Do sincerely apologize, but just wanted to give you an overview. No problem. I think we seem to be having some network error. Do sincerely apologize, but let's jump straight into Truth of the Matter. I should be hopefully joining with a wonderful gentleman to discuss what happened on the 7th of October. Now, 7th of October 2023 is just over a year ago. But unfortunately, the world has changed a lot. Very interestingly, the world has changed a lot with massive level of propaganda and other things that goes on in the media. To an extent today, people no longer are even carefully thinking about what really happened on the 7th of October. It was a serious day. It was a day of a great tragedy that struck the nation of Israel. Israel, since the Holocaust, had its massive, the largest attack on the people group of Israel. But of course, this time in the I'm sorry. This time in the apologies. I think we still have network issues and so on. I do sincerely apologize. I think essentially, of course, we'd be discussing that in Truth of the Matter, and subsequent to which we'll be discussing UK's structural inability to deal with Islam in the segment Nation Under God. But first, Truth of the Matter. For those who are living in the West, in what are meant to be Christian nations, such as the UK, US, let's say even the other nations which should remotely be Christian, you would be familiar with the idea that over the last year or so, there have been hate marches, hate anti-Semitic marches, quite regularly with a large turnout of people. And the marches are, of course, initially they called for a ceasefire in Israel, Gaza. And subsequent to which, essentially now the propaganda has moved on to asserting quite overwhelmingly that the nation of Israel is supposedly committing a genocide. That's what we are hearing. And this is what we are hearing in the media. This is what we are hearing when we go to the streets of our nations. And what you find is when you get to the bottom of what really is happening, we find that people aren't just divided on opinions on top of an agreed upon truth, but rather even what is truth seems to be argued upon. Facts of what really happened just over a year ago in Israel are argued even today. Who is the oppressor? Who is the oppressed? What is going on? Who should we sympathize with? Who should we sympathize for and empathize with, and so on, are questions that are being asked. And in the mainstream media, we get the view that, some in some way, shape, or form, Israel has oppressed the people of Gaza and the people of Judea and Samaria, what is popularly called as West Bank, and that the focus right now should be on what is apparently a genocide that is happening in Gaza, and so on. So this is what is happening in the media. This is what you hear. Unfortunately, as a Christian, I am a little bit ashamed of the fact that there are many, many Christians who also have given into this propaganda. And that's, they have come to this conclusion that somehow we need to safeguard, the people of Gaza, which we should, but people of Gaza from the hands of Israel, as if Israel is intent on wiping out the people of Gaza. That's a propaganda that Christians have also given into, and I'm really upset about this. And this is one of the important projects that I wanted to take up as I started on this journalism venture. So today, what I want to do is roll back from where we are today. We've had plenty of propaganda, but I want us to go back to what really happened on the 7th of October, just over a year ago. And I want us to go through the details, hear from so-called, the horse's mouth. I have a precious friend who is waiting for me for the interview right now. And I'd like to hear from him, essentially from his own background of being from Jerusalem, from Israel. I'd like to hear from him his thoughts on what happened on the 7th of October. And I want to make sure, through God's grace, that all Christians and non-Christians don't lose track of what really happened on the 7th of October, and we keep that in our memories for years to come. That's the agenda for today. And I'm going to invite right now a close friend and acquaintance from Speaker's Corner, a founder of Israel Advocacy Movement, Joseph Cohen.
I will. Thank you for having me. Hopefully you can hear me loud and clear.
I can. Apologies, Joseph. We did have a few technology issues earlier, but I can hear you loud and clear. And I'm really glad that you're able to join with us at short notice, especially for this particular episode. I'm really glad that you're able to join with us today. And of course, you are aware of the topic for today, 7th of October 2023, lest we forget. And of course, ultimately, my goal for today is to make sure to hear from you details on behalf of you, your family, your friends who are from Israel, and of course the wider nation, which is really a large family, the nation of Israel, and of course the Arabs of that land also. I'd really want to hear from you with the ultimate intent that we clearly leave in the minds of the audience today an impression that what happened there was a very serious and tragic event. We don't want this to repeat in the nation of Israel's future through God's grace. And we want to make sure all the Christian nations are going to be with you. That's going to be my main intent. With that, let me start with this question, Joseph. So I don't know if you were in Israel at that time on the 7th of October, or if you were here in the UK at that time. But please, if you can give us an overview, maybe a couple of minutes overview of what really happened. If not on your behalf, if you weren't there, maybe on behalf of your family and friends. What really happened? If you can give you an overview, that'll be lovely.
So I'll actually start with scripture, because this is a religious channel, and I'm speaking to a community that shares my scripture, which shares the Old Testament. And in Ketuvim, I think Ecclesiastes in English, it's written, that which has been will be, and that which has been done will be done again. or that which has been done will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Tragically, the Jewish people have experienced massacres in our history. And you mentioned hoping that we could prevent such a massacre in the future. And tragically, I don't believe we can. I believe until the coming of the Mashiach, the Jewish Messiah, until we have peace on earth and all the nations bow down and recognize the kingship of Hashem, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, the Holy One, blessed be He. Until those days, tragically, I think my people will continue to experience the kinds of massacres that we have. But this particular massacre was the first one that occurred in my living memory. Certainly, as a religious Jew, as a conscious Jew, this was the first massacre I experienced. And I wasn't here in Israel. It was actually on a holy day for the Jewish people. It was on the concluding festival of Tabernacles, of Sukkot, on Simchat Torah, on Shemini Atzeret, a day of great celebration in Israel. We celebrate the completion of reading the Torah. And for your audience, I'm sure you know I will, but many of your audience may not. We are commandment-following Jews. Whatever the Holy One, blessed be He, commanded the Jewish people to do, to keep, we strive to keep those laws to this day. And so I, like most Jews in the world, was celebrating, and I couldn't use electricity because it was a festival. So we had no idea what's going on. So we start to hear murmurings. It's a 2-day festival in the UK. It's a 1-day festival in Israel, which is another reason for Jews to come home. So I was in the UK, in London, and we began to hear murmurings that something had happened. So we're asking the security guard. All synagogues, tragically, in the UK have security. Churches don't need security guards. Mosques don't need security guards, but every synagogue in the UK has a security guard on it. Our schools in the UK look like fortresses with the amount of barbed wire, surveillance cameras, security. It's a tragic necessity that we face in Chutz La'aretz, outside of the land of Israel. And so we're asking the security guard, who isn't Jewish, what's going on? And he's looking up on the internet, and we begin to get a sense that there's something big happening. This isn't like the other terror attacks where maybe there's been a stabbing or, heaven forbid, an explosion on a bus. This felt bigger. And as the day built on, we began to get more of a sense. Second day festival is amazing for a community that can't use the internet. It's amazing how much information we were able to extract from newspapers, from people, and beginning to piece together by the second day that this was horrendous. And it was only on the closing of the festival, when we could finally turn on our phones and begin to read, that we realized the magnitude of what had happened in Israel, that this indeed was the biggest massacre, the most horrific and tragic massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And a couple of weeks later, I went to the site of the massacre. I visited Israel because I wanted to give testimony. I wanted to be able to witness the horrors that had happened. And the scenes that I walked through, with blood still fresh, but dried on the wall in sites like Kisufim. So I heard explosions in Gaza, just like literally just over the fence from where I was. I could see the fighting. I could see Hamas and the IDF clashing in Gaza from the Gaza border. Witnessing it, you begin to get a sense of what it was like for a Jew to live prior to the 1950s. We've had a sweet ride. For the last few years, it's been comfortable for the Jewish people. But the following week, I was shook to my very core, as a week's now passed and we're in synagogue. And the rabbi announces that we're now going to say the prayer that the Jewish people say for massacred communities. For massacred communities. Imagine belonging to a people who have a prayer that you say when communities have been massacred. Now, we say this prayer at other intervals to remember that throughout the years, remember those that have fallen previously. But I'd always imagined villages put to the death by crusaders with swords, or marauding pogroms in the Muslim world as Jews were slaughtered. I never visualized until that day what a massacre of my people truly was. I lost no one in the conflict. Family-in-law of mine lost people on October the 7th. In fact, in the street I'm in at the moment, there's tragically a very well-known individual who lost his life after being kidnapped by Hamas on October the 7th. His name is Hirsch Goldberg Polin. His family are a few doors away from me now. On this street alone in Jerusalem, we've lost 2 people to the war. So there's been a lot of tragedy, a lot of loss. Fortunately, for me, none of my immediate family fell, but this is a small country and we're a small people, and everyone knows someone that was kidnapped or murdered. And today, so just for context, there were 1,200 people kidnapped on October the 7th in a brutal attack on Israelis in the south of Israel. 2/3 of those that were kidnapped were civilians, around 250 of them foreign nationals or foreigners, workers who were working in the fields in the south of Gaza. One of the real tragedies was the communities that were slaughtered were left-wing peace peaceniks. They were very much for the 2-state solution. In fact, many of them had helped Gazans. There was one woman who was kidnapped who used to take Gazans from the border to Israeli hospitals on a regular basis. And so these were the people that were butchered, innocent civilians, innocent Jews, and they were slaughtered because they were Jews. And actually, I tell a lie. It wasn't just Jews that were killed. To this day, there are Muslims being held hostage in Gaza, along with 100 hostages in total that are still there. At least half a dozen of them are Muslims. Hamas do not differentiate between Thai worker, Jew, or Muslim. They see them all as collaborators with the Yahud, with the Jews. And they showed no mercy, and they carried out the most depraved events imaginable.
I'm deeply sorrowed, of course, Joseph. It's not news today. It has happened more than a year ago. But like you rightly said, Israel is a very closely knit community. It's one large family. And therefore, even if you don't have someone in your immediate family who is impacted, you always know someone who knows someone who is impacted. I want to really highlight that portion which you mentioned earlier, which is, of course, you would have heard the Crusaders, do some stuff. You would have heard of pogroms, whether it's in Europe or in the Muslim world in the times past. But essentially, since Holocaust, in your lifetime, like you rightly said, this is a deep tragedy. And please help me understand. I've never been to Israel. I'd like to, through God's grace, at some stage. I've never been to Israel, but I've heard of various reports. I hear of these bomb shelters. Prior to October 7th, bomb shelters. Within 3 seconds of few seconds, I can't remember if it is 3 or not, of a siren going, how people have to run and hide in, of course, of the likes of what happened here in the Second World War. But no other nation, goes through these things on a sustained basis. So it was already a bit too much for me pre-7th of October. But please, if you can paint a picture of how a nation which was already prepared to see all sorts of hostile activity, for it to go through 7th of October, I'm assuming, the sort of the alertness would have gone up maybe a few 10 notches or something. If you can please paint a picture of, how you saw life before 7th of October in terms of, anticipating attacks, and life since that, how would you see that?
So we're still in the midst of things at the moment. So it's very hard to tell. We have soldiers in Gaza. We have soldiers in the north, in Syria, in the Golan. We have soldiers in Lebanon. So we haven't got used to the new reality because we're still in the middle of a multi-fronted war. I would say, though, that to really bring to life to your audience what it's like to live here, even before October the 7th, I was in a city called Sderot, which was badly affected by October the 7th, before the attacks. And I'm driving through, and one thing that people don't understand is this is a nation for children. What I mean by that is, you've got kids, bring them to Israel. The playgrounds here are incredible. So I'm driving through Sderot, and they've got this ninja park. And it's like no ninja park for kids that I've ever seen. It's got incredible obstacles. It's filled with kids laughing, but every few meters, there's a bomb shelter. Like, so the kid's going to run and do the obstacle. And then if the sirens go, they've got a matter of seconds. And depending where you are, whether it's Sderot, whether you're closer, it can be anything from 5 seconds to 15 seconds to where I am, a minute and a half. It can really depend as to where the attack is coming from, as to how long you have to get into those shelters. But this is the insanity that people don't comprehend. Israelis, for us, for Jews and Arabs, or any Israeli citizen that lives here, rockets, missiles are part of life. And I'll actually tell a story that will really bring to life the spirit of this people. So in every house that's built, they have something called a mamad, a bomb shelter in the house. It's like a room which has reinforced concrete walls. It has metal shutters. If gas can't get in, if there's a chemical attack, every house is built with these. So regulations in the UK is you need to build fire doors in case a fire breaks out. Here, they build bomb shelters in all the new buildings. If you're in an older building, you maybe don't have what's called the mamad. So you have a public bomb shelter which you can go to. Now, I'm in an older building, and on the 13th, 14th of April, Iran attacked, and they launched the biggest ballistic missile attack. Well, certainly it was one of the biggest then. I think the one that followed was the biggest. But they launched a ballistic missile attack on Israel. Rockets rained down from Iran, drones from the Houthis in Yemen, and the sirens went. And so I fancy myself as being pretty fearless a lot of the time. And I was terrified. I tried to film a video and I'm shaking as I run down to the bomb shelter because I'm not used to this. And so I'm down there, and my family are the last to leave the bomb shelter because we're in an older building. So it's a public bomb shelter, which is used by it's at the bottom of the building. It's used by everyone in the building. I'm the last person to leave. The crazy thing is for this was we've been getting murmurings all day there was going to be an attack. And I tell my wife that there's going to be an attack. We're expecting it. And then we got the thing, they fired. There's been an attack. The rockets have gone off and they fired missiles. And so she says, so how long have we got? 8 hours. 8 hours? What do you do for the next 8 hours while you're waiting a pending missile strike from Iran? My wife went to sleep. I didn't. I went on Twitter and just like WhatsApp groups trying to work out what was going on. Where were they? What's going to happen? Anyway, so the rockets, we hear the explosions overhead. A lot of them are intercepted by the Iron Dome in Jerusalem. And my wife goes back to sleep. I go upstairs. 10 minutes later, I hear tanks outside my apartment. So okay, I'm in social media. I've got to get my camera. I've got to film these tanks. I run outside to film the tanks that are now in Jerusalem, but there were no tanks there. What there was the dustbin collectors. They were collecting the garbage. 10 minutes after Khomeini fired his missiles, the Israeli spirit is so strong that these people were collecting trash. Like even Khomeini's missiles aren't going to deter these people. This tough people from surviving, and so normality resumes. So to answer your question, the threat of violence, the threat of rockets before October the 7th was very real. But this is a courageous and strong people, and they just live. They are not intimidated. We are not intimidated. We go about our business and we refuse to cower. We are not weak-kneed Jews. And so there is a difference to say. We didn't expect October the 7th to have happened, but it did. And so we are more vigilant than ever before. We are stronger than ever before, and we are more determined to stay on this land and fight for our ancestral right to live here and to live free of tyranny.
I hear you loud and clear. Of course, it's the only land left for the Jews to live in, unfortunately, to call their own, call as their own homeland. And I really want to underscore what you described there, which is that for the Jews, it's a daily reality that, you have a choice of enemies. Very unfortunate. You have a choice of enemies, whether it is from the east or the or maybe from the south or from the north, and so on. And if not for the fact that it's quite tragic, it would be funny, for a nation. But this is quite tragic, and I want all Christians who are watching to really take note of the fact that we are dealing with a people who went through severe persecution for hundreds of years, but still there is no rest. And of course, we can talk about messianic prophecies and so on. Maybe I'll keep that for another occasion. But we have, as a Christian nation, a responsibility to understand the gravity of what's happening and to take appropriate, as best as we can, support Israel. And so thank you very much for that, Joseph. And you of course touched on this earlier, which is clearly still we have hostages. So the tragedy, although it happened, I repeat this multiple times. I say things as if it's done and dusted, but the reality is it's still ongoing, and there are 100+ hostages who are still in Gaza. We don't know the particular state they are in right now, and hopefully with changes in geopolitical events, they'll be released sooner rather than later. But can I ask you this, please? You clearly know that still it's an ongoing issue, but soon after the 7th of October 2023, maybe after a couple of weeks of when the incident happened, the tide really has turned. No one seems to, or not many seem to be conscious of the fact that, look, here we have a nation which has been attacked and have still not come out of the tragedy. And there has been a conversation about how, the international community wants to enforce ceasefire, and they want to, of course, talk about, assert quite falsely that Israel has or is committing genocide and so on. How do you view that? What do you see? I mean, of course, from your perspective, what do you see? What would you like, nations such as the UK, US, and so on, what would you like changed in these nations in terms of the core of our nations in understanding and remembering the tragedy that Israel goes through?
So we always knew we had a few days of sympathy. We knew that in the wake of the worst massacre of Jews, that it would be impossible for the international community to turn away. But we knew that memory would be short-lived the minute we started to respond and to try to rescue those hostages and to ensure that such an atrocity could never be carried out again, which is exactly what we've done. Now, the West has fallen, and with the grace of God, it may be able to stand again, but demographics and politics are ensuring that, or certainly at this point, seem to be sending the West into a downward spiral. And so you have the forces of evil have a much louder voice at the table than the forces of good, unfortunately. And so When millions of people, when 1 million people is slaughtered, or 500,000 people in Syria, 1 million in Iraq, a million in the Sudan, when you have huge massacres of people in ethnic conflicts around the world, there's no protests. There's no people on the streets. There's when the Uyghur Muslims in China are basically they're placed into concentration camps and prevented from allowing their community to have continuity, to exist. There is silence. There is no protest movement. But when it's the Jews, there are hundreds of thousands of people mobilized on the streets against Israel, against the Jews. And unless something is to change, and this toxic alliance of Islamism, so extreme radical Islam and far left extremist forces, unless there is a change in the political direction of the West, which there may well be with the likes of Trump and Brexit, etc., then what I would like to see happen will never happen. And what I would like to see happen is the world treats Israel fairly. And it judges Israel by the same standard that it judges every other nation. So in the Gaza conflict at the moment, there is a 1-to-1 civilian to militant death toll. In one of the most densely populated areas in the world, Israel has managed to achieve a 1-to-1 civilian to militant ratio when Hamas are going out of their way to try and maximize civilian casualties. And Israel has done that by creating safe zones where civilians can go, by warning civilians of pending attacks with millions of phone calls and flyers dropped onto areas, by ensuring that 700,000 tons of aid has been able to flow into Gaza, so there isn't a famine like we witnessed in Yemen. And so Israel has been able to achieve something that no other military has been able to in these kinds of campaigns. And there has been no campaign like this, to be frank. But compared to the closest ones, no military has been able to achieve this. And I would like the world to judge Israel by that standard and not by this fiction that there is a genocide, that Israel is trying to genocide the Palestinians. If Israel wanted to genocide the Palestinians, they would do Hiroshima or Nagasaki. In fact, according to the tonnage of bombs that have been dropped, Israel has dropped more bombs per tonnage than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yet the death toll is a fraction, and it's a 1-to-1 civilian to militant ratio. So clearly Israel is being very precise with who it targets and how it targets them. And I would like the world to recognize that. I would like the world to treat the Jew in the same way that it treats the non-Jew. And I think the only way the West is going to be able to do that is if the people are able to reclaim their nations and prevent them from spiraling into the abyss.
Absolutely. This is where part of our mission comes in. It's a shameful thing that the church has lost her voice in the UK and elsewhere, and then the church is giving into false narrations, and hopefully through God's grace, we'll claim that back and bring the UK and US and other nations to a scriptural foundation, where we are very clear. So, but it's not too much to ask. Treat us fairly. It's a very plain, simple ask. And it's a tragedy that the West, including the UK, are unable to do that so far. And I take personal responsibility for our failures so far, and hopefully through God's grace, things would change. I want to touch upon this in the last few minutes, Joseph. So of course you said the West has fallen. Hopefully there'll be change. But how about these supranational institutions? We hear about, UN RWA, we hear about UN, and of course, everyone should be familiar with the International Criminal Court's, verdict on the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the defense minister and so on. How do you see these things? What is the general take that you have on these things?
So these institutions have been hijacked. So a great example is the Palestinian refugee. Now, today, there is a strong argument that there are Palestinian refugees from Gaza. There is a war. At times of war, people flee. But that's not what we talk about when we're talking about the Palestinian refugees. And this is all tied into the bodies. So who are the Palestinian refugees? So in 1948, 5 Arab armies invaded Israel when Israel declared independence. Between 500 and 750,000 Arabs fled the war, like people flee all wars. Civilians move when there's a war to save themselves, to save their families. It's the sensible thing to do. So they were the original Palestinian refugees. The United Nations in 1949 recorded 750,000, and they housed them, or they put them under an organization that they created called the United Nations Relief Work Agency, UNRWA. All sounds fair. So there were 750,000 back then. Today, UNRWA has 6 million Palestinian refugees. How can that be? How can there be 750,000 in 1948, 49, and today, in 2024, there's 6 million? And here is the insane part. So the United Nations has a refugee agency, the UNHRC, and they house 122 million refugees. So there's 122 million refugees over here that the United Nations looks after, and then there's another 6 million which are housed in this special agency. Why is that? Well, the UNHRC would never recognize the Palestinian refugees as refugees. Why? Because UNRWA came up with an absolutely insane definition. They said to be a refugee, you need to have a ancestral connect. You have to have a patrilineal link to an Arab who lived in mandatory Palestine, British mandatory Palestine, between 1946 and 1948. So if your father's father moved from Iraq in 1945 and lived in Hebron for 3 years, then the United Nations Relief Work Agency considers you a refugee. This is so perverse that they consider Gigi Hadid, a literal multi-millionaire American supermodel that's lived in a safe country her entire life and never fled a war, a refugee. Meanwhile, almost every Jew descends from genuine refugees who were forced out of Europe, who were forced out of the Arab world. But the United Nations doesn't consider us refugees. So not only have they created this organization has more staff than the UNHRC. It has 30,000 staff to look after 6 million refugees, and the UNHRC has 13,000 to look after 122 million. For every Palestinian refugee, the United Nations gives them, the so-called refugee, $240. For every other real refugee who's living in an actual tent and fleeing a real war, they only get $43. So what's going on? The United Nations Relief Work Agency was hijacked years ago. And the reason that they basically from its inception, it's manned almost entirely by Palestinian staff, by Arab staff, 30,000 Arabs who work for it. And they have one purpose, and that is to not support the Palestinian refugees, so-called refugees, but to support them until they return. Return where? To the very house I'm living in. The United Nations Relief Work Agency is basically a vehicle that's used by the international community to try to end the state of Israel. Because if you are forever perpetually a refugee because your great-great-great-grandfather moved there from Iraq in 1945, the only way to stop being a refugee is to return or to die. And so the United Nations and the United Nations Relief Work Agency are captured institutions, and they wield incredible influence on the global community. The United Nations is probably the greatest example. The West pays for 90%, pays for over 90%, it's like 96% or 94%, I've forgotten which way around, of the budget comes from the West. Islamic nations pay 6% of the annual budget. Sorry, this is of UNRWA. And the West pays the rest. Yet the West has an equal voice to Iran. In fact, Iran will sit on here's a great example. Iran has sat on the Human Rights Council. Iran currently, or just recently, chaired the Disarmament Commission. So they literally, Iran, who was building nuclear weapons, chaired the Disarmament Conference. It's insane, because Iran has an equal voice to the UK, despite paying for nothing and despite being a dictatorship. And so what happens is, to join the United Nations, you need to be a democracy. And I hate to check all these lists, but it's all under Khomeini. And so what the United Nations basically is a democracy of dictatorships. They have a democratic vote on the international community equal to England or Britain, equal to Italy. Yet, at home, they don't even give their own citizens the right to vote. And so these institutions have been captured by powerful international voting blocs, which vote along geopolitical interests. And so Israel, being an isolated nation, the only Jewish nation in the world with no mineral rich resources to offer the world, is continually and perpetually attacked by those nations which seek our destruction.
Quite tragic. So, in other words, essentially, there is no one to support the nation of Israel. And here is where, of course, the plea on behalf, my duty and my responsibility, and hopefully many Christians would take this seriously. As Christians, we have the same Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh, and we understand that we have to provide support for the oppressed, for the ones who are in need, the ones who are harassed quite wickedly, and so on. And so Christians have a very important task right now. So people in the UK, people in the US and elsewhere, we need to really take note of what Joseph is sharing with us quite seriously, lest we forget. So before we part ways, Joseph, of course, World War II, World War I here, we have the Poppy Day and all these things where we say, lest we forget the serious contributions that our soldiers in the UK and so on have rendered for the safety of our nation. But unfortunately, for what Israel is going through, no one seems to be remembering. What would your appeal be to all the Christians who are watching, and also non-Christians? A final, maybe 1 minute appeal, lest we forget. How would you like us to remember what is still not a case which is closed, but how would you like us to remember going forward?
So there's two things I'd like you to remember. The Jewish people have an eternal covenant with the Creator of the world. He will protect us. He will ensure that our people survive and continue to thrive. There are going to be ups and there are going to be downs, and those downs will hurt. But my people are a nation of survivors. We have the blood of survivors flowing through our veins. The Romans tried to destroy us. Where are the Romans today? Pharaoh tried to destroy us. Where are the Egyptian pharaohs today? The Assyrians, the Nazis, the communists, they all rose up to destroy us. And where are they today? They are forgotten. They are, well, not forgotten, but they are consigned to history. My people lived. We outlived the Nazis. We outlived the pharaohs. We outlived the Romans. We outlived all those that sought to oppress us. And we will outlive Hamas. We will outlive Khomeini. We will outlive all of these Islamist extremists that seek our destruction. And so what I would like you to remember is that those that stand with the nation of Israel will be blessed. Those that stand against the nation of Israel will be cursed. And so do everything that you can to strengthen the ties between the Jewish and Christian community. Do everything that you can to ensure that the West stops spiraling into the abyss and is able to change its trajectory and change its history and continue to contribute in the way that the West has contributed to mankind in the past. No, like the West has, Judeo-Christian nations have shaped modernity. And we must do everything that we can to ensure that that continues. You continue to shape and you continue to be a positive change. And we will be okay here. We will be okay in Israel. I'm more worried for the West. I lived in the West and I left the West. So it's really, we don't want the West to be forgotten. We want the West to continue to live, and we want the connection between Israel and Christendom, between the Jewish world and the Christian world, between the West and Israel to be stronger than ever before, because we have common enemies and shared values, and we have many positive certainly in more recent years, positive experiences together, and we are stronger together. So yeah, what's crazy is most people in Israel are more worried about what's happening to the West than we are here, and we have bombs fall in our head on a daily basis. There's shooting attack just a couple of days ago, just around the corner from where I am, and we're more worried about you guys. So do everything that you can to ensure that the West doesn't fall.
Well, quite poignant. You might be able to face physical violence, but if you lose your soul in terms of morality and standing, it's a quite tragic thing. Also, thank you very much, Joseph. It's in our best interest. Thank you for reminding us. It's in the Christian nation's best interest. Those who bless Israel shall be blessed. God, Israel is still God's firstborn son. And of course, I was reading through the book of Isaiah and so on in the last few days. God has a future for Israel, but let the Christian West better make sure we're part of a future in God's presence by sticking to God's principles. Thank you very much, Joseph. It was lovely speaking to you, although on a very sober subject. And I do sincerely send the wishes on behalf of me and all those who know me for the safe return of all the people who have been captured, who are in Gaza right now, and also for return back to normalcy as best as Israel can have. Lovely speaking to you. Thank you very much.
Amen. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So there we go. We have heard from Joseph, a lovely man. And as you can see, of course, demonstrating the spirit of what the people of Israel normally have, going through tragic circumstances almost on a daily basis, and of course, but still being able to have a pleasurable conversation. He is more worried about the Christian West, and I can't disagree with him at all on this. I can't agree more, as a matter of fact. And this is where, Light of the World comes in, and hopefully there are other Christians who are working hard, not just in sharing the gospel on a daily basis to all those who need to hear the gospel, the fact of redemption through the Messiah, Jesus Christ, but also in understanding that life in this world is a little bit more than sharing the gospel, which is also in understanding that we are perfectly aligned with God's will. So, lest we forget, 7th of October 2023, and what is still continuing to happen. is a tragedy. And all that Joseph, on behalf of the nation of Israel, is asking us to do is, of course, stand, but also treat them fairly. And hopefully, through God's grace, Christian nations haven't entirely fallen. Hopefully, we will stand up again and proclaim loudly to the people in power, to the general public, that we ought to be a Christian nation. And the nations such as US, the international community, Judeo-Christian West, have to be Christian nations, learning the Bible properly and standing with God in issues of such significance. And I hope that through God's grace, all the Christians who watch and also non-Christians would have understood in a deep manner that what was only retained in the collective memory of our nations for a few weeks should really be now brought back to our memory and should be perpetually maintained in our memory. So we know that Israel is a nation which is facing threats on a daily basis from the south, from the east, from the north, and from forces afar, including even supranational institutions. Through God's grace, let's fulfill our responsibility carefully. Thank you for being with us, and we'll return to you in our second segment. Hello and welcome again. Of course, this is our second segment. In the previous segment, I had a lovely conversation with an acquaintance and a friend, Joseph Cohen, and he gave us some very important things to bear in mind in relation to Israel. 7th of October 2023, lest we forget. Now, I want to talk about what's coming up right now. We have one more segment. And this is about UK's structural inability to deal with Islam in nation under God. We are supposed to be a nation under God. The UK is, for good or bad, known as a Christian nation. We have had our good things in the past, and we've also had our terrible things in the past. We have not always acted in the best interest of God or according to God's will. Now, hopefully, at least in the future, we'd actually be a nation which walks under God. As Christians, we have a great responsibility. And right now, I'm going to rant on a little bit about something which is fundamentally lacking. People might have seen this, especially with the recent riots in relation to what was clearly a terrorist attack in Southport. There is anger, but there is no proper channel for people to be able to vent their frustration. Rioting clearly isn't the way to go, but we should have, as a nation, structural features where we can officially be able to clearly give feedback in saying what on earth is happening. And right now, as a matter of fact, I want to address more widely the fact of the lack of a structural component in our nation in relation to dealing with Islam. Our society in the UK and also other Christian nations are facing tremendous things because of Islam in our lives, whether it is terrorist attacks, whether it is sexual issues such as the grooming scandal that happened in the UK, whether it is issues such as female genital mutation problems, whether it is honor killings, whether it is people in our own nations fearing that they would be killed if they left Islam. And therefore, clearly, Islam having an upper hand in imposing the Islamic Sharia in our nation. Whether we talk about any of these aspects of Islam or something else that I haven't mentioned right now, one of the fundamental problems we have as a nation is that no one seems to be taking responsibility. In terms of leadership, who in the nation, is there a political leader in terms of people in power, prime minister or others, who are taking up a proper responsibility in following up with what is happening in relation to Islam? Or is there some judicial system in place which has understood that there are serious issues because of Islam and therefore taken it up for a study? Is there some other commission that we have in our nation which is studying the impact of Islam in our nation? Or is it being researched by official researchers, properly government funded academics who are researching on this area? Is there a way by which the public, the general public, let's say the least of the citizens of our nation, is there a way by which they, one of them, could find out how exactly as a nation we have processed all the information in relation to Islam so far, and what kinds of conclusions we have come to, or we are planning to come to, and so on? Is there a platform by which one of the least of the citizens could find out this particular information? Is there a platform by where, who were the rioters associated with Southport riots? Is there a platform where they can use to say, look, these are my problems in relation to Islam. I am deeply frustrated that there is no official responsibility for what is happening in our nation. And may I please add my voice to it? And may I please find out the progress in relation to, as a nation, how we are tackling Islam? There have been hate marches, anti-Semitic marches in our streets, calling for the genocide of Israel, while proclaiming that Israel, falsely, clearly, is involved in a genocide. The only true genocide that I can see being spoken about is the call for Israel to be wiped out from the map. What can we do about these hate marches? Is there an official channel, an official complaint, a simple complaint that the least of the citizens or even residents of our nation could put in to say, look, I also add my voice to this study or to this particular commission's work, and so on? The frank reality is that there is no such official channel or platform open at all in our nation today. And therefore, we see terrorist attack after terrorist attack after terrorist attack. People dying sometimes in the tens, sometimes in the hundreds. But all that we can do is hope that the anti-terror, secretive anti-terror police groups are somehow doing the right thing, or somehow on top of understanding Islam, or somehow aware of what they exactly need to do to proactively work on these issues. The police aren't meant to handle these issues. Clearly, when you have a nation which has been attacked so many times as the UK has been, I would hope and think that the leaders of our nation would have already said, hey, look, we have serious issues at hand. We are going to have an official commission studying Islam in detail. I started studying the Quran in depth about a couple of years ago. Prior to that, I had interacted with Muslims. Of course, I was already aware of what's happening. You don't need to read the Quran to understand what is happening because of Islamic terror attacks in the world and so on. You don't have to read the Quran. And therefore, I have been interacting with Muslims for a very long time at Speaker's Corner. But in the last couple of years, a couple of years ago, I began to read the Quran for myself in detail, cover to cover. And so far, I have read the Quran cover to cover multiple times. And I prepared my systematic notes. And I'm in the process of, through God's grace, writing a couple of books. One on the history of how Islam really began, and another on Islam's hatred towards Judeo-Christian societies. And when I began studying, and when I saw the proper, positive evidence of essentially saying, this is why there are attacks in our nation. This is why the women, Muslim women in our nations, are not having freedom. This is why the non-Muslim women in our nation are abused from the Islamic community. This is why girls, children are being abused in our nation. I can see a very clear correlation between what is happening and what is showing up in the news and what is there in the Quran. It's plain, it's simple, it's obvious to see. Of course, it takes much effort to read and understand. And when I read the Quran, or when I decided to read the Quran, and as I finished reading the Quran, the first couple of times I really was thinking that, hey, you know what? There will be commissions set up in the UK and elsewhere who could be studying the Quran in this manner, because clearly the government needs to deal with this junk on a daily basis. But unfortunately, what I find is that there exists no such commission. There exists no official body of any description in our nation which is studying the ideology that is contained between the covers of the Quran today. There is no body which is studying officially what is happening in mosques today. There is no body that is studying in detail about how young children from Muslim families are being forced to take up the same ideology, taking the ideology into one more generation. There is no such body which is clearly studying in the view of a regular citizen. All that I find is that small groups of anti-terror institutions such as the police and perhaps as part of MI5 and MI6, some work that is happening. But unfortunately, no one from a public sphere is privy to the kinds of information that these people hold. Why do they monitor some prospective terrorists and are not monitoring someone else? We don't have a clue. We are not privy to this information. It is in the public interest right now to see how far the ideology is in this Islamic community. And therefore, my dear friends, I'd like to comment to you, even though we may want to call ourselves a Christian nation, we are seriously, structurally impaired. The church isn't speaking up so far. The church isn't speaking up about what is happening in relation to Islam in this nation. And there is no structural ingredient, building block in our nation trying to address the problem of Islam. Some of you might have heard the interview that I had with a lovely friend Joseph in the segment Gone. And of course, he spoke about Islamism. And part of my duty is even to assert that it is not even an extreme faction of Islam which is problematic. The problem of Islam is in the very text. Cover to cover, if you go through, you clearly understand that anyone who wants to follow this text faithfully will end up having extremist ideas. And this is the need of the hour in relation to Islam. If you are a Christian who is watching, if you are not a Christian and still watching our program, please, may I please comment to you, there needs to be mobilization right now. A mobilization that will help us get to a place where we get the ruling powers, whether it is the current government or any future government, we get an official department, perhaps even with a secretary, a minister, someone with an official responsibility, someone who is democratically elected with an official responsibility, and therefore is aware that when he doesn't fulfill the official responsibility of bringing down terror attacks, of dismantling this Islamic ideology from our nation, that he won't be elected again. Someone who is answerable to the people of our nation. We need such a structural component, without which we thoroughly are incapable and purely are at the mercy of people who, for the sake of wanting the votes of millions of Muslims in our nation, would never, ever do what is appropriate in relation to Islam. And so, if we want to be a nation under God, we need to take this seriously. It's only a small start for us today. I've spoken about this at Speaker's Corner in the times past. But now I want to continue speaking about this. I want other Christians to continue to speak about this. Today, of course, it's a monologue from me today. Hopefully, through God's grace, we'll give a voice to many Christians in the future in this program of A Nation Under God, where Christians speak out, Christians call out Islam not as a religion that we merely disagree with theologically, but Islam as an imminent threat to the very existence of our nation. Islam has to be properly categorized as a mental emergency and should be confined to the dustbin of history. The entire infrastructure that goes behind Islam has to be dismantled. Islam has to be recognized for what it is truly, which is a fascist, totalitarian ideology with a political objective, not dependent on a supernatural force acting behind it, but rather with mere human violence is intent on destroying our nations. It's time to wake up. And through God's help, better late than never. And I invite all Christians, Bible-believing Christians, faithful disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ, to take up responsibility on top of our spiritual responsibility to share the gospel of our precious Lord Jesus Christ to the world, the redemption that's available only in the name of Jesus Christ through the world. On top of that, also to take up our civic responsibility seriously in dealing with this imminent threat to the very survival of our nation and nations. God's richest blessings to you. Thank you very much for staying with me today, and we'll see you next week.